Good morning. My name is Nandini Chatterjee, and I work at the University of Exeter, and I'm one of the PIs of the Cast in Stone project. Thank you very much for making time to be interviewed for the project. For our listeners, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. Murad Qureshi. I'm a senior consultant for management consultancies in the environmental field, and I've had a long historical interest in this issue as both in public and out in and out of public office, because I know this is something that hits a nerve, I should say, with a lot of people from the Indian subcontinent.
That is indeed right, and that is why, of course, we are speaking.
Yeah.
You mentioned about your profession. Would you mind for our listeners just telling us a little bit more about your role in public life? I know you've been member of the London Assembly, and whether you had a role in the Westminster Council at any point as well.
Well, yeah, my previous time in public office involved being a councillor in the city of Westminster, where a lot of all these notorious statues are actually physically based. And also, I've been an assembly member for the whole of London. In the latter for about 14 years, and as a councillor 8 years. Most of that time was in opposition, but there was a period when I was an assembly member working with the first mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, as well.
Thank you so much. And also, for our listeners who may not necessarily know and understand this fully,
Yeah.
the role of the London Assembly, is it quite similar to what the Parliament does for the entire country? As in, does it actually make rules or laws or policies, or is its job to basically just hold the mayor accountable for what they're doing?
Yeah, essentially, it's holding the mayor to account. We scrutinise, it's called scrutinising, and the biggest control we have is over their budgets and what they're proposing annually. We unfortunately the position doesn't have legislative powers, and I think that's what's needed there. So that's the difference between the London Assembly and Parliament in Westminster. The other confusion I should sort out, the City of Westminster is the local authority covering the whole of the City of Westminster, but where Westminster Parliament is based. And funnily enough, I think as a councillor, you may have actually more influence on local matters to the area than the national politicians. And I think the statues is one instance of that.
Wonderful. Thank you for clarifying that. In fact, could you remind us of the years when you were an elected member of the Westminster City Council?
I was a councillor there from 1998 to 2006, and there was also overlap from my time at the London Assembly, which was 2004 to 2016, plus a year during COVID, 2020 to 21.
Thank you very much. I actually saw some reports online of your having organized a meeting or a conference at the London City Hall in which the Nobel laureate
Yeah.
Amartya Sen spoke. If I'm not wrong, it's in 2007, perhaps.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a bit more about that event?
Yeah, no, that was arranged. It was on the 250th anniversary of Polashi, the Battle of Plassey, otherwise known as the Battle of Plassey in the UK, and I thought it was a relevant time to look beyond, look behind and beyond, and then look forward. Because for Bengalis, that's a very critical event to the fate of Bengal and also the rest of the Indian subcontinent. Clearly, and yes, I invited Professor Sen along because I thought he's the most outstanding academic Bengali, certainly, and probably the most famous one around, to give his commentary with other commentators as well, like Nick Robbins and Faisal Islam.
And what was the theme of the conference? Was it remembering the Battle of Polashi?
We actually, it's funny enough. I was thinking about this before the interview, and I mean, the history was kind of dealt with by Nick Robbins, who's at the LSC now, and I mean, I think he highlighted very clearly how unique the history of the East India Company is, and I think those of us who've grown up with it know very well that it was one of the rare instances of a company controlling a country or a state, physical country, and had access to, for example, all the revenues that the previous administration in Bengal had. So he emphasised that. I think the professor himself was emphasising the present and the future, and Faisal some of the economics. Faisal, I think, was at the Observer or Channel 4 at the time. He's now at the BBC. So I think I had a good platform of speakers, and it passed over without too much controversy, which was the way we were playing it. And it was sponsored by Cambridge University Examination, because they wanted to promote some of their exams, and yeah, that worked. It was very well attended. I think people saw the use of it, and I was able to use the City Hall facilities on the basis of my annual entitlement to host an event. So when I did this, I've done many other events on other themes, but I thought on 250th anniversary of Polashi, we couldn't miss this opportunity. And you know, there's a fair amount of photographic evidence. Unfortunately, not as much social media stuff, because people don't realise even in 2007 there wasn't as much social media as we are exposed to now. Practically anything you say or do is recorded and put out straight away and things like this. But nonetheless, I think it struck a chord, and certainly when Amartya Sen says anything, it travels, and it did.
That's wonderful. And I would be very grateful if you were able to share any photographs or any
Yeah.
newspaper clips that you might have to hand without going into too much trouble. But thank you so much for discussing that. So I've actually extended my planned first question, but I think it will be very useful actually for listeners to know this. But now to kind of return to the statue of Robert Clive
Yeah.
in front of FCDO. Can you tell me how you got interested in the statue itself and what it brought to your attention?
Yeah. I have grown up in the city of Westminster, the Paddington part in the north, and during the 70s and 80s. And one of the regular things I found myself doing when we had relatives from Bangladesh, they were always keen to see the statue. And I remember particularly the first occasion when this particular uncle, who was, a prominent personality in Bangladesh at the time in the early 80s. He's now passed away. But anyway, he asked me to go, and he was doing all touristy things, but he wanted to do this, and I said, okay, no problems, we'll go there. And it was we went there off Whitehall. There's not somewhere everyone knows about, but I'd worked out where it was. It was the first occasion I went there, and I was actually a bit taken aback because he spat at it. And I thought, what was that about? And then I then realised it was the historical context. And he just made the comment, well, if this bugger hadn't screwed us, Bengal would have been a different place, and who knows, we could have been top dog in the world. That was a comment he made. So it resonated with relatives of mine. And it's a kind of discussion we have had in our dinner table. So, Clive, Robert Clive, you're right to say that, but actually, I think the English refer to him more often as Clive of India to give a more glorified image. But I was also aware of where he eventually, one of the places he lived in was in Mayfair and Berkeley Square, which has got one of these blue plaques, which calls him administrator and a soldier. And the way my family looks at it is more it'd be better described as a looter and a mercenary, because when the East India Company was in formation, it did have its own private army, but it was not a part of the British Army at all. And actually, a lot of the angst about the East India Company, to the credit of a lot of British people here in the UK, was that it was a private company running a state, and it was doing it very badly. And that included people like Adam Smith, as well as Dr. Johnson at the time. So yeah, having grown up in the locality of my Bengali background, and my view is that it's not only just Bangladeshis, West Bengalis I worked about, it's many Indian. I suspect I have, whilst my politics won't be the same as in VJP people at the moment, Indian elections, but they've probably got similar sentiments as well on this front, given what other things East India Company did in the rest of the subcontinent.
Yes, thank you. I mean, that's such a rich story, actually, and it answers already my second question, which I was going to follow up on, as in, how did you learn about Robert Clive? So, I mean, in summary, it seems as if you learned it. You said at the dinner table, like it's some
Yeah,
sort of community history. Is
yeah.
that it? Would that be correct to say that, or did you also study about him anywhere in school? Because you grew up in London.
Yeah, yeah.
So where did you learn about him?
Well, I think principally from the dinner table would have been the first port of call. I didn't do any history actually at school or when I went to further education. I'm grateful, because I think one of the first history lessons I certainly learned on the dinner table was that, well, my dad had told me this very clearly, was that the history is more often than not the victor's interpretation of events. And what I was certainly picking up outside of the dinner table was that Clive was seen as this great imperial English hero, and that didn't tally with what I was hearing from family, certainly from my family setup, with relatives passing through and what have you. And it's seen as a time where Bengal lost its way considerably. Um, I don't completely blame Robert Clive. I think there were things not going well in Bengal at the time. To allow an outsider to walk in like this was incredible. But there's no doubt the Robert Clive, who came from Wiltshire, saw an opportunity and seized it, and he played various elements off on each other and was able to win a battle and take charge of Bengal in a way that I don't think has been done before, since, or hopefully never again as well.
As an educator, actually, I'm the professor of history. I am both, but also the mother of a child who's grown up
Yeah,
here in London. I'm actually curious about your comment about not taking history. Um,
yeah.
why did you not take history? Like, is that something you were just not interested in, or was it the content?
It was well, actually, I mean, it's funny. I steered towards economics and sociology rather than history. I've got to confess. Um, and you've got to remember, actually, I mean, at school, I mean, actually, I mean, I've got a nephew who's done history at Warwick. He got a first and what have you. And it's funny. I do so. I've discussed history outside of it, but I think the history when I was at school in the 70s and 80s was quite different, I think, to now. And so, for example, one of the things that British history I've struck me is that there is a particular obsession about Henry VIII and his 6 wives and Anne Boleyn. Well, like I said, I haven't done history at school or at college or university, but I find that very strange. When I would have thought the English Civil War would be of more importance, but it doesn't get much anywhere near the traction that Anne Boleyn's story does, or whatever. And personally, yeah, I understand the conflicts between the Pope, but that was about it, really. Civil War, English Civil War, did actually mean that Charles I was assassinated by by parliamentarians. And I think it's an intriguing story of how a country did that, went to republicanism, and then went back. But that's actually very peculiarly not. There's not a lot of discourse on that here at all. And I personally look, having not been exposed to history in a structured way, I've always questioned, and I'm glad I've had that ability to do that, because maybe if I'd done the formal history, I would have been regurgitating all this without really appreciating it better. I think it's actually got easier to learn history now, simply because there's so much available now. YouTube's and what have you. I just think you just got to have a critical mind about things, and you don't necessarily have to go to further education. I think there was a time when you had to do that to get credibility. But I think there's a lot of credible alternative narratives out there, and not necessarily. I do. Yes, I don't. I'm not knocking academic vigor, and I think that's useful. But I think a good education allows you to challenge things and think for yourself and wonder whether this stacks up and see things in a different perspective. And I think that's what good historians do, allow you to do that. But yeah, frankly, I think actually the way history was taught in my school days, I think you had to regurgitate it. And in some ways, it's the same. Well, I'm also, as you will be aware, in the Indian subcontinent, I was always astonished. Actually, used to frighten me when my cousins over there, they could recite the whole of Shakespeare plays and things like this. I found that intimidating, I've got to confess. But I never sensed that maybe they fully appreciated it with a critical faculty, which I think is what you need. And I think as a historian, I think you appreciate that more so than I do. And so that's where I was coming from. I have a critical faculty, not just of British Indian history, but British history proper. And I think very often it's reflected in what's the priorities and what are the emphases. And like I said, I'm amazed at actually how little coverage the English Civil War gets in comparison to Henry VIII. Culturally, plays and movies, and it was a regular theme that comes up, which has always baffled me. I don't know how many more different angles you can give to the ambitions of Anne Boleyn's family and Henry VIII's intentions, but there you are.
Thank you so much for saying that. Actually, it is really striking, isn't it, that the history of democracy and constitutionalism gets so much less space than one violent, clearly increasingly mentally demented person's kind of violent intrigues. Actually, you're the second person I've interviewed who's pointed out, and the other interview is that of Alexander Holmes Brown, who got his education in Western Australia. And he too was very, very clear that he learned none of the history in the school system, and he educated himself. So again, like open access knowledge is something that's making a difference. You also mentioned community history. Let's again turn to the statue itself. And very quickly, you have actually talked about your relative's very strong physical reaction to the statue. Just very, as an overview, like, how do you feel about the statue? You and others, apart from your relative whom you have already discussed. I mean, does it offend you? Why does it offend you? And if so, yeah, could you describe?
I don't often go that way, but I know of its existence. That's enough for me, quite honestly. And it's quite interesting. It's got a bit of history. I mean, Clive actually died very notoriously. I mean, he, I mean, the suggestion is that he was an outcast in polite society in London. Dr. Johnson and people like this at the time did suggest he committed suicide and what have you. So that's the context I'm certainly aware of. And actually, if I remember rightly, the statue was built with public prescription. I think people paid for it. And I think people don't realise many of the statues around there. So if you go to Whitehall and Trafalgar Square, There's one for someone of the Sind. I've forgotten his name, but yeah,
Charles
many of
Napier, isn't it?
Yeah, Charles Napier. Sorry, yeah, Charles Napier of the Sind. So there were similar statues put up. So I can imagine, dare I say, people from the Sind probably go to Charles Napier's statue and have a similar reaction against him to my relatives. But there was a time when this was quite popular. They have been forgotten, I think, but they're there. And it also does have a prominent position in a place which is where the foreign affairs of this country have been conducted for many hundreds of years. And I certainly am aware that many of the officials in the Foreign Office are aware of its presence. Um, and you can't avoid it. It came up in recent context, and not in terms of statues, but in terms of the portraits that are hanging in the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office inside King Charles's Street. Yeah, where that some of them have suggested that some of them be taken down. I would just add, if you're going to have that discussion, maybe you should also look outside on your doorstep.
Good point. So, what have you been trying to do in relation to the statue, and what organizations or institutions may you have been associated with in your efforts, and what's your goal?
Yeah, I mean, it comes up every so often, this issue. I like to think I'll be around long enough in this local context of Westminster to make a contribution. Because many of these things just don't happen just like that. They take time, is my personal view. And whether I'm in or out of office, I'm going to keep an eye on this one. The last time it really came up was when there was a statue pulled down in Bristol of slave owners. And that's not a charge we've got against Robert Clive. But it came up in that context, and there were many Indians who were making similar suggestions based here. And then there were actually a lot of both British Indians and expat Indians passing through academia, business, and what have you. And that's the last time I got involved. I'm not proposing that gets pulled down physically as a result of anger. I'm not sure that's the way to go about it. But I do think that there should be an assessment of these, whether we need these statues anymore. Does anyone know what they are, and are they relevant? And I think if you're going to persuade anyone to take it down, you've got to think of also what's to replace it. And I think that's half the campaign as well. It's not just the case against, but you've also got to come up with other proposals. And the one I would propose there for a local hero from the city of Westminster is Alan Turing. I think that would be a good site for him, given his contribution to Britain, and I think I could persuade a public out there the need for that and get the relevant group. So I think there's two sides to this. There's the notorious history of Robert Clive and what it represents, the statue. Do we need it now anymore? What's it represent? I'm sure, when Indian officials go into the Foreign Office, they can't avoid it, particularly if they come from the back way into the FCO office. And at the same time, an alternative, a positive alternative, which is relevant to today's time. And I think Alan Turing would be the one. He was actually born and lived in the city of Westminster in the north, in Maida Vale. And I think at the appropriate time, I can mobilise the local support to that suggestion. I don't think it will be too hard to raise the money to do that with the arts establishment in London, certainly. So I think yeah. So while there is the campaign against, dare I say, largely kind of negative in response to the history around Robert Clive and his contribution to the East India Company. But I think it's equally important that you have to come up with an alternative. And Alan Turing's personal contribution to the world of computing during the Second World War, and the fact that he actually had a tragic death as well when he was chemically castrated because of his homosexuality, I think would be something which would be welcomed in British society. So that's the way I see it, and it won't go away. Who knows? The next time it may come up is when, I don't know, we've got. I don't know. I mean, it looks as though the VJP will be back in power for a third term. That's why I'm hearing from all the polls in India. Tell me if I'm wrong. But if that's the case, maybe the next time they all walk into the Foreign Office, they may point this out and say, look, really, is this any longer necessary? I would then find myself, funny enough, in a very strange position of being better with them on this one.
Yeah, I do not envy you in that position, I have to say. But who knows, good comes from which direction?
Yeah.
Actually, in fact, my next question was going to be which events or which people of the past would you rather remember? And you've made a very compelling case for Alan Turing, and I do agree that if there was a hero we could all stand behind, it does seem like, and he is an excellent candidate in that sense. I do have a question as a South Asianist, and in relation to the history we've been discussing of Robert Clive. So the alternative cannot be a figure from Bengal. Is that not something that is that because that's not something you would want, or it's simply not politically possible?
No, it's actually, I mean, it's interesting. It hasn't occurred to me, actually, I've got to confess, but that's another perspective to take. I'm certainly aware that in some ways the history of partition, for example, is dominated by what I call the Attenborough interpretation of partition, and I've always felt that Bengalis like Tagore, Netaji have all been completely taken out of that narrative. Well, so again, from my family discourses at home, I certainly was aware, but actually, if you watch all the films, British films on partition, then they're not there. For example, Tagore had access to the British establishment. He was knighted. He was and what have you, and he gave all those back because he was appalled by the lead up to partition, let alone partition itself. And I think sometimes that's often forgotten. We tend to emphasise Rabindranath Tagore's kind of poetry and writings and what have you, and music, but he was actually, he was a political activist. And there were many other Bengalis. Netaji is the other case, obviously, and there are many others. So yeah, I think that if there were Bengalis, someone like Rabindranath Tagore would probably be the most acceptable, given his contribution in other fields. But I would only do it on the basis that to emphasise he was actually a political animal, much more than I think people realise, even though he's been written out of the British take on partition, because I think, like I said, I think you can't knock the Gandhi film, because for many Brits that was the only time they actually began to get their heads around what happened. But there are many other things that me and you certainly would know. And if there were many Bengalis involved, because actually, let's face it, Bengalis were more worked up about the British Raj than anyone else, for the simple reason we were probably the biggest victims of the East India Company and then the British Raj, and the centre of it was for most of its time in Kolkata as well. So I think we probably felt it more keenly. Rabindranath Tagore strikes me as probably, if there was a Bengali, it would have probably him, because I think he's known more widely. Netaji, I know Bengalis will know him. but I'm not sure he's known beyond that. Yeah, and I mean, you know very well he's a cult figure, and yeah, maybe the British won't like the idea that he was involved in setting up the Indian National Army as well in Singapore and things like this. But Tagore would probably be more acceptable, and I think he did make a contribution which has been forgotten. And I'm just grateful for his contribution to the national anthems of both Bangladesh and India. And I think he's in a unique position to have done that. And so, yeah, I mean, it hadn't occurred to me, but that would be the Bengali, I would say. And I think he was part of the response to the dying days of the British Raj, and efforts to divide Bengal previously. I mean, my personal take, is that the liberation of Bangladesh in '71 was the unfinished business of partition, actually, and it didn't go away. And who knows? I mean, for example, if the liberation of Bangladesh had gone on longer, I think I'm grateful for the intervention. It saved my neck and my family. But if it went on longer, it could well have extended itself into West Bengal. I mean, 10 million of us were there anyway, so it could have. I mean, and Indira Gandhi was outstanding. I think it was a high point in her political life. I think I think it's equivalent of Margaret Thatcher's high point. I think in British political life was the Falklands War. I think the Bangladesh Liberation War for Indira Gandhi was certainly high point. But I just made that. This discourse is not going to go away, is what I'm suggesting, and I do have my own take on it, and my own feeling is the land of Bengalis, Bangladesh, is a concept much wider than some have interpreted it now, which may be an Islamic State, for example, or whatever. But it's actually it's much more comprehensive and secular than I think people appreciate. But yeah, I think Tagore's contribution, I think, is often forgotten. I've written letters about it in the Guardian. I've got some coverage. I may send that to you to just emphasise that and where I'm coming from on this perspective. But he would be, if it was an Indian Bengali, it would have to be him, I would have thought.
Fantastic. Actually, there is a statue of Tagore in Totnes, in Dartington, because of Elmhurst, who went to kind of work with him and set up Sriniketan and so on. And Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, whom you mentioned, I mean, of course, has the additional problem of having attempted an alliance with Hitler. So, I mean, so in terms of acceptability, that's a different spectrum altogether. And I know, like, it's not about recommendations here. It's really about having a very broad conversation, and a lot of it is theoretical. But I'm interested in so many different aspects of what you said. How about Siraj, though, the man that Clive so unfairly deposed? I mean, all said and done, Tagore is a Bengali national hero, like you said, for both nation states. But even if it does sound unpleasant to say it, I mean, he was an upper caste Hindu Bengali who have been dominant throughout the colonial period. What about Muslim Bengalis, as in people with whom Bangladeshis can possibly more directly associate with? So does Siraj not qualify?
Well, look, Siraj, and there's also, I mean, the other dominant Muslim Bengali is obviously Sheikh Mujib. I think they're a lot less known. Basically, I think you've got to have some truck with what other Brits may know about, and I think it will be much more difficult. I haven't emphasised the religious aspect because I think I don't think Tagore did that. There's also people like Nurul Islam and others. I just think he's got a footmark already, and politically, what he did is something which a lot of Muslim Bengalis would stood with him on, against the division of Bengal. People like my grandfather certainly did. Well, he was more comfortable. My dad certainly felt more comfortable with Bengali nationalists than he did with Gandhi, Gandhiji. That there's no doubt about that in my mind. What exposure I had to my grandfather was quite clear to me. But I was getting that from him from a personal level, and not from my exposure here in the UK. And so I'm grateful that I did pick this up. I didn't understand it at the time because I was hearing the British public, like I said, the Atterburyization of the British partition, and yet I was hearing my brothers throwing complete doubts on it and say no, the G didn't have as much hold as people make out. It was convenient for the British to have someone that they could actually deal with, even though they felt he was difficult. And there was a reason why the Nehrus and what have you, they felt comfortable because they were people that came through the British establishment, Harrow and places like this. And that was the same with Jinnah, actually. Although he was more of an outcast, he was probably more of an Englishman than any of those people. My grandfather reminded and tells me the story that when Jinnah basically said Urdu was going to be the language of Pakistan, his response was the bugger couldn't even say it in Urdu. He could only say that in English in Dhaka. Which he felt really. I checked this. He's right. His Urdu was very weak, and he said it in English in Dhaka, and people like him were there, said, and they were just completely taken aback. Which I think shows. That goes into another whole arena. But I do think. I was getting these insights without, and I could see they weren't telling with what I was hearing from British history take. And over time, I've managed to marry them up and realise actually I was given an insight here which I hadn't realised at the time, and said more than can imagine. I mean, my brother's point was he would have been probably, if they'd offered him a seat as an MP in the British Parliament, he would have been far more comfortable there than in the new state of Pakistan. Because he was more of an Englishman than Nehru or the other Gandhi, that's for sure. I mean, and they had both passed through London and travelled a bit before they went back to be the leaders of independence.
Thank you so much for actually joining me in this very broad discussion of the subcontinent's history. So bringing it back now towards the practicalities and in London, right? So in 2020, which you mentioned that there were some demands after the Colston statue was taken down, that the statue of Clive be taken down as well. So I have a couple of very short factual questions.
Yeah.
One is I noticed that there was an e-petition started by somebody called Meera Somji to the Westminster City Council asking for this statue to be replaced somewhere else. And the Westminster City Council responded, and it's online, to say that they didn't have authority to do so because it's actually, well, they were very unclear, actually. They said it's temporarily licensed to English heritage and it holds it from historic England. Anyway, were you in any way involved with that petition? And can you tell us anything?
I think I may have suggested it. I thought that was the way to start, get the local. I was saying, look, I know there's international interest from India, what have you. But believe you me, I told them you need a local basis to this, and you need local support. I think the idea may have come to me, and I may have put the idea forward and said, do that, and then look. And I did ask around who is actually responsible for the statue, and it was made quite clear to me that all these statues are actually in the hands of the local council. This comes back to my earlier point. The parliamentarians don't actually have a say. They'll make a hoo-ha and people will go to them. But actually, it's local authorities and, dare I say, councillors, if they're interested in this at all. So look, the next time it comes up, we would have to do similar things. Just mobilise that whilst you have the international stuff. Because otherwise, the council won't need to respond. It only respond because I think the numbers weren't as strong as we were hoping, but uh, no doubt at further times when that comes up, I'll probably make the same suggestion again, and this time hopefully we'll get a lot more interest. Interesting enough, the nature of the administration in the City of Westminster Council has changed, which from Tory to Labour, which may make a difference. But it would have to be activised, activised at another occasion, and I've got no doubts there will be. This isn't going to go away. I'm also intrigued by the recent coverage, I think in early April, about the paintings in the FCO need to be taken down. I think that discussion is not going to go away, and on the back of that, I certainly will be in the social media arguing, well, if you're going to do that, why not deal the statue on the doorstep of the Foreign Office?
Excellent. Actually, the council said in its e-response that it denied responsibility. It said that they didn't have authority, and authority rests with Historic England, and which is ultimately under the Department of Digital Culture, Media, and Sport, which is basically like the central ministry, right? So
Yeah.
this brings me to the question of, when you try to make a change of this kind, what kind of barriers have you seen? And like, how do you think you'll overcome those barriers in future?
Yeah, look, yeah, there often are a huge amount of barriers. Parliament Square, for example, up until recently, was in the charge of City of Westminster before it was transferred to the Mayor of London. Even in 2000, it took more than 20 years for that to happen. About 15 years it took to happen. And unfortunately, it takes a long time to get things done in the UK, has been my experience. I'll give you another example, just a simple thing. One of the first things I did when I was in the Assembly, I don't know if you've noticed in London that there are some rickshaws running around, which are completely unregulated. There are very, very few of them in the West End, but they do. You can notice them. Anyway, I just argue that they should be, they should be of a standard size and build, and they should be regulated, licensed. And I thought that proposal is obvious. It's done even in Kolkata and Dhaka, where you have rickshaws still. But it's taken 20 years for that legislation to go through. I was amazed that you needed legislation to do this. I thought I could get 2 officers to tell the rickshaw wallahs that you need your vehicles MOT'd and checked, as well as your sales license, before you go and do this trade. That took more than 20 years to do. Yet when I go to Kolkata and Dhaka, where I do get on rickshaws, I could see, I have the safety of the knowledge that this vehicle is okay to be sitting on, and 2, that the driver has a license with the corporation or whatever. We don't even have that in the UK. But the experience of even a simple suggestion like that, it took more than 20 years, and I'd given up on it very early on. I said that was it. But I've waited. Someone else has picked up the challenge and actually got the legislation through. And I've mentioned Parliament as Parliament Square. I've got no doubts it may take a similar amount of time. That's why I will always be around, because as long as I'm in London, I will be in the City of Westminster in the north. But I do know what's happening down in the south, and there will be other occasions where both attention will be drawn, and 2, people will look at what to do. What we've got to do is make sure all the ducks are lined up for something to be done. I suspect the best time when this is going to happen is when the British government sees it in its interest to do that. Dare I say, if you want to keep a future Indian government happy, that may be one way of doing it. That's me being cynical, but all that groundwork will suddenly be done very, very quickly.
Yep, bureaucratic processes move faster with political will, is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
got no doubts about it. I mean, for example, the on Punt Square there are statues of Nelson Mandela, Gandhi, and a few others. Those two, so well, Nelson Mandela became big of a political hoo-ha, but when it was seen as the interest of the British government, it happened. And then when they wanted one of Gandhi before Modi came to town, they made sure it happened very quickly. So who knows if it may be something that they decide to keep to make a future if he gets a third term, which sounds likely. It may be something they do to keep Mr. Modi, PM Modi happy. But I've never heard him express views on this front. I don't know what his views are on the East India Company and the British Raj. I presume he would have been an opponent at that time.
Yeah, who knows? My question then is, in a kind of wrapping up mode, so when they took down the Colston statue and threw it into the canal, it was of course fished out soon and then put in storage, and eventually they've created a display in M Shed in the Bristol Museum, and they've decided to keep it laying down with all the graffiti on it, etc. If the Clive statue came down, what would you like to see happen to it?
Well, on this front, I've also there's another part of what I was thinking at the time. The Museum of London is in the Barbican. It's actually moving into a new site, Smithfield Market. I think there's space there to put up these old statues. So people they'll still be around, but they'll be in a lot. Well, probably under the hand of the London Museum, and they can manage it as they see fit. But the space they'll have will be considerably more than they've got to the present site. I don't know how familiar you are with London, but the Barbican site, it's much smaller than what they're going to get in Smithfield. And I have suggested to them that they may want to have a collection of these old statues. They'll probably give them more recognition. If you move the one of Robert Clive there, you could then move Napier of Sin there, and all something. Eventually there's a whole collection of them that can be put up at museum, and the Smithfield Market is very big. I think it's got the head height certainly to accommodate them if need be. So yeah, my proposal would be that they get moved to an appropriate museum, and I think the most appropriate one is London Museum. I did attempt to start tentative talks on that front, but if I get back into public office again, who knows? I may suggest that there, because that's what I think. You've got to, if you're going to take a statue down, you've got not only a pros and alternative, you've got to propose where that goes to, and I think those are the three elements. Most campaigns will be, oh, we want to get rid of it, da, 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 da. But actually, when you come to the nitty gritty, I think those are things you would have to come up with suggestions and show to people that actually this is more thoughtful than just a violent reaction against it.
Yes, I agree. I can actually visualize it. It's like in the British Museum or in the V&A, for example, we have these whole floors, which are like series of statues. So I can almost visualize that it'd be like that. My question is though, like, what difference does it make? Whether it's in the public square or in a museum? How is it different?
Well, yeah, I mean, well, it goes back to the thinking when they put those statues up. I mean, clearly those who paid public prescriptions to have these statues thought it was a monument and a statement they were making at the time of past heroes of the British Empire. And I do think that there is a need to move on, and I still think actually a lot of British history is still having that difficulty. But that would be a sign that that's been done, and that and I think symbolically this is how it can be dealt with alternative heroes for the here and now. And then if you want to go back and see them, it's there in the museum.
Fantastic answer. So my sum up question is a sort of slightly philosophical one, as in this is all like kind of classified under heritage, etc. So heritage, English heritage controls this statue, etc. If you were to define heritage, how would you define it?
Well, I've seen it defined. I think the problem we have with heritage is it needs some wider definitions of heritage away from this very strict um, colonial imperial context. I think there's enough of us with different backgrounds and what have you to shed different light on this heritage, and I think that needs to happen more profoundly. And here's an instance where it can be done, I think, very, very easily and very sensitively. As I said, I mean, in my heritage, I grew up with a heritage on the dinner table at home and the heritage I was exposed to outside. And they didn't marry up because I was hearing two different interpretations. I think it's important English heritage reflect increasingly that diversity of heritages and that and the different perspectives it gives to what's been highlighted. And for example, there's a simple, one of the things, the blue plaques is another. I don't know if you've seen them in London, and actually there's almost an alternative blue. English heritage have normally done this, but there's an alternative blue plaque schemes by other people, which doesn't take as long and is not long-winded and doesn't need their consent. And that's an alternative heritage of London, which English heritage hasn't really understood how to reflect because it takes so much time and energy for them to do things. And I think if they don't keep on board, they will lose that monopoly. And people will define what they think is relevant. So, for example, that the London history that I'm signed up to since the 70s and 80s doesn't get particularly reflected. It's in my part of town we had people like Bob Marley lived in the locality when he was in political exile, and there is blue plaques up for him, but it wasn't. But that it takes them much longer than it should do, and I think they need to reflect this much better in what they put up as well as take down, and the sooner the better. I think the country's moved on, and it's reflected in the population makeup as much as anything else.
On that beautiful note, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.